Good morning, everyone. The Media Institute of the Caribbean welcomes you to our third installment of our Climate Justice Journalistic Perspectives webinar series. This effort is supported by Open Society Foundations. It is my pleasure to welcome you all as President of the Media Institute of the Caribbean. My name is Kiran Maharaj, and I will be your MC for the presentations this morning, and I will be assisting with the moderation as well. Just so you all know, this is a topic that the Media Institute of the Caribbean believes is very, very significant for our region. We also feel that regional collaboration and activation at this time, not just by the media, but by civil society actors as well as policymakers, is very, very important for us to establish any kind of change and in order to derive the benefits that we feel are necessary at this time in our region. A few house rules. We ask that everyone please keep their cameras off and their microphones on mute, and it also assists with your bandwidth. If you do fall off for any reason, please rejoin with the access information which would have been sent out as early as this morning as a reminder. If you have questions, because of the numbers in the room, we are going to be using our chat box to be able to take all of your questions. So I ask you to please put those questions in the chat box, and when the time comes up for us to ask them, the moderator will be able to do that easily. At this time, I want to also remind everyone that we are recording the session for the benefit of others who are not with us, and for us to have this as part of our legacy and education that will remain in the virtual space. So please remember that and be mindful of it, in particular if you're changing your devices. I know sometimes we have to switch from one device to another, but when you do that, sometimes the microphone comes on its own. And in addition to that, we may not know who you are unless you label your name correctly. So a reminder, please, to ensure that you label your names properly. That way our administrators will be able to allow you to re-enter the room. If at any time you have any questions or concerns, feel free to direct message myself or Fazilet, who's our project manager, and they will be able to assist you and answer any of your questions. So I think it's time for us to start now with our first speaker, Mr. Wesley Gibbings, who I think really needs no introduction. But for those of you who may not be as familiar with him, he is an award-winning Caribbean journalist based in Trinidad. He's a media trainer and press freedom campaigner. He is founding president of the Association of Caribbean Media Workers, former president of MIC, member of the steering committee of the Global Forum for Media Development, GFMD, and is a current council member of the International Freedom of Expression Exchange, IFEX, which is based in Canada. His work on Caribbean media development and journalism has been published in several books, instruction manuals, and journals. In 2017, he was presented with the Percy Kaboza International Journalist Award by the U.S. National Association of Black Journalists for his work in the areas of press freedom. Wesley is also a published poet with 5 collections to his name. He plays steel pan, and he is an artist. And I have already told him that I am going to ensure I take care of the first show he does, because I think I could make some good commission on his work, right, Wes? But we're very proud and happy to have him here. And the topic that he is going to go through this morning is important for journalists everywhere, because all of us have a storyboard concept, and MIC also has, our own storyboard that we recommend, developed with investigative reporters and editors. But I think bringing home the point of what we need to get into that storyboard for a topic like climate justice is really going to be an eye-opener and is going to give us a couple of tips that we always need to keep top of mind. So with that, I introduce Mr. Wesley Gibbings.
Thanks a lot for the flattery, Kiran. I won't describe myself as an artist. I can do a little bit of art. But what I pay attention to these days is the practice of journalism and the practice of journalism in the Caribbean in particular, because I think that among the pillars of development we have at our disposal in the region, journalism offers one of the best opportunities to take our societies forward. Not as any explicit act of promoting development of one form or the other, because I have views on this issue of the development support journalism. And those of you who attended previous sessions know my view on this, which is that I think that in any event, good journalism is going to have a developmental impact, as opposed to a journalism which has an explicit developmental agenda. Because as all of us would know from the various countries that we come from, the whole notion of development is not politically neutral. And it's something that we need to flesh out, to argue about, to debate, to be prepared to change our minds about. And there are few issues that have offered us the opportunity as societies to engage in that kind of bargaining, because that's what it is in the end. It's a process of bargaining among sectors and among different sections of our national communities to ensure that everybody gets a fair deal. And when we talk about climate justice, that's essentially what we're talking about, which is countries getting a fair deal out of what needs to be done in order for the world to continue to prevail, but also within our countries to ensure that all sectors get a fair deal and are given an opportunity to thrive and to prosper, and in the process to play a role in development. So that's my little sermon to start with. But I think that will help you understand where I'm coming from through all of this. Even in the development of the stories, and I'm going to take you through a process that has, as Kiran has said, that has been developed by the Media Institute of the Caribbean in collaboration with an organization called Investigative Reporters and Editors of the United States. It's a methodology that's very much evolving to ensure that when we conduct investigative journalistic reports, largely, that we don't miss anything, that we ensure that we overturn every stone along the way, and that we interrogate information as we confront them. But before I get into this whole thing about the storyboard, those of you who've done film and those of you involved in, particularly in the visual media, would understand what storyboarding is all about. This is a bit of a variation on the theme, because what we're going to do is to select from the dozen or so story ideas we received during last week's session that was hosted by Freeman. And there were one or two submissions that we received outside of that. Very interesting one by Esther. I don't know if Esther Jones is here with us this morning yet. If Esther is here, you know, she came up with an idea, a story idea, or story ideas that are very, very intriguing and interesting, and we'll explore some of it. But the idea here really is to employ a methodology that's being developed by the Media Institute, but to recognize it as something that those of us who operate in newsroom environments, we do anyway. So I'm very happy to see that we're very heavy on the presence of journalists this morning, because you would know as I go through the methodology that this is what we do intuitively in our newsrooms every day, at our news meetings in the morning or in the evening, whenever they do take place, in our brainstorming sessions with editors, that we do cover a lot of these bases. But what the MIC proposes to do with this methodology is to encourage a more methodical approach to interrogating story ideas in order to to make them come to fruition and to appear as news stories in our newspapers or in our various broadcast media and online. But before I get into this, I just want to ask a question. And you can use the hands up thing. Everybody who followed the release of the most recent assessment report by the IPCC yesterday, hands up. Who paid attention to what happened yesterday? The launch of the new IPCC report. Dale, of course. Jackson. Those are just 2 hands, and 3, 4. Very good. Excellent. From a journalist, and you can type it, or this is one of the sessions where you can feel free to turn your mic on. What stood out for you in the report? I mean, there are 3 components of it, and I went through the summary for policy makers. I scanned through the actual report. It's pretty lengthy and very technical, but I went through. Yes, Neela will provide that. What stood out? Freeman is saying the urgency of the action required in a short space of time.
Yeah.
The urgency.
Wesley, I agree with you. Not only this report, but the last few reports. There's the question of the time is running out, and we need to act now. It's time for action. Enough equivocation. And we have that problem. For instance, they put up a financial mechanism, and yet, even in this day and age, we have to go through the loop for about 3 years before you put in a concept note, before you get to first disbursement. Our 1.5 report that was generated with the help of the Caribbean science shows that if we don't act now, we are doomed. We're talking about 1.5. The aspiration is 1.5 at the end of the century. What that study showed is that by the next decade, we might be hitting 1.5 on this business as usual scenario. So the whole question of time, the whole process seems to be time insensitive at this moment. And I think that is one of the most important messages that we have to communicate, that we have to stop the talk and to start acting.
Thanks a lot for that, Dr. Trotz. I know you have been a major proponent internationally on that particular point regarding the urgency. But what else? Tashwa is talking about the inaction of the major players, inaction by the major players. Any other things that stood out? Okay, let me go because I'm going to run out of time at this rate. Did anybody notice the repeated reference to the term climate justice? The use of the word justice, the use of the word equity. Segoni said she feels as though the only thing preventing us from taking advantage of acting is political. Yes, so that the political obstacles. Zaidi is talking about energy. But I want us to focus for a minute on the substantive subject that we've been addressing since last week, which is the matter of climate justice and the inherent inequities that the climate crisis finds us being confronted with. And what I noticed both from the policymakers' brief and the substantive report is that climate justice, the uneven impacts of the climate crisis and the uneven or inequitable opportunity among sectors and among countries, those issues are highlighted in a way that I have not seen highlighted in previous assessment reports. So one of the things I did was I did a word count, a word check. I looked to see how many times in the summary, the summary for policymakers, I found reference to justice, particularly with reference to climate justice. More often than not, when it appeared, it appeared alongside the notion of equity. And that's at the heart of what we're discussing during this series. There's 5 references in the summary document. In the substantive document, I'm not sure if Dr. Trotz had taken note of this in previous assessment reports, but in the current report that was released yesterday, and I must tell you, I'm probably among the first, because while the press conference was going on, I was refreshing the website in order to see when they would put up the actual documents. So I'm probably among the first people to download it. And one of the first things I did, particularly since we're looking at the issue of climate justice, is I did that word search for justice, and I read the respective sections. In the substantive report, you have over 350 references to this issue of climate justice. And the fact that in executing the just transition, and just transition is a term that appears multiple times in the substantive report. Sorry, Neville, you wanted to chime in on something.
No, I don't want to interrupt you when you finish.
Yeah. Is that, so the thing is that the scientists and the experts who are looking at it, it's not only us from civil society, from media, and people with a general concern about development in the Caribbean, who are looking at the place for justice and equity within this whole notion of transitioning from where we are to where we need to be, but that the scientific community is itself paying at close attention. Neville.
Yeah, Wesley, you hit a button. This is precisely the point I wanted to make about Steve's presentation and just transition. And I would urge our journalists, our media in the Caribbean, not to be sidelined by the global action that is required, but what's happening to us right here in the Caribbean. There are several issues with just transition and climate justice that are applicable in all of our communities. And I think, look, my own country, Guyana, right now is a good case in point. Just to give you an example, there's a fight between a community in the country that basically is being forced to host 2 waste management facilities in their little rural community, one of which basically is dealing with radioactive waste. And there hasn't been that level of consultation or discussion. When we talk about bargaining, is like tango, it takes 2 to tango. Now, when you look at the decisions, some of the decisions that are being made, energy transformation, etc., even with our low carbon development strategy, where a lot of emphasis will be going on using the ecosystem services or forests, basically to generate climate credits and finance. But what happens to all of our Amerindians, our indigenous communities who basically own part of that estate? Are they being considered as we transition? So it's very important. Yes, we have to be very vocal at the global level about climate justice in several of these instances. But for us in the Caribbean, I think this is where there's a lot of work to be done as we move forward.
Thanks a lot for that, Neville. Now, a point was made in the chat by Raymond Henderson that, you know, to him and I suppose to many other people, when the word justice is used, there's a sense that it has to do with court, it has to do with lawyering, it has to do with a lot of money and so on. And it is true that in the Caribbean, we do experience this phenomenon of a very negative reaction with regard to the justice system, which is in itself does not always appear to be just. But just climate justice as employed here, as I put in the chat, really emerges out of this notion of social justice and equity. Is everyone among us enjoying equal access to the resources or to the assets of our nations? And at the same time, are we being obliged to meet our end, our obligations to our societies in an equitable fashion? Or is it that there are these imbalances that pit those who have against those who do not have? And at a global level, it's a very similar kind of dynamic. And if you look at the climate crisis issue, you will find that, and as I said in my presentation, that whereas 25% of the global community uses more than 80% of all of our natural resources, that the rest of us, the 75% of us, are made to bear disproportionate shares of the burden of these challenges, and therefore the burden of adjusting to these challenges. And that's what this whole discussion is really about. So I want us to, that's a concept. Let's try to break this down now as journalists into stories, into material that audiences can pay attention to so that they get the point. And this is not propaganda. It is not free PR for governments or scientists or for any, it is simply the practice of good journalism. Let me bring up on the screen the template that we have been encouraging journalists to use. And some of you, the journalists among us, would have been through this already through in previous MIC sessions. So as Kiran said, this methodology is being jointly developed by the investigative reporters and editors and the Media Institute of the Caribbean, basically to promote the pursuit of investigative journalism that seeks to answer all of the key questions and to also address the issue of the changing face of media and what are the media requirements. So we basically begin the investigation by posing a key question or presenting a key hypothesis. So you begin with the hypothesis, and it's, I suppose the scientists among us will see this as very closely aligned to scientific investigation of their own. That you begin with a hypothesis, you pose a question, and then you go through the phases of examining if all of the conditions are met, if all of your questions are answered, what's the maximum story? What's the ultimate output that you would like to see in terms of your investigation? And we have employed this methodology. If you go to CIJN.org, which is the Caribbean Investigative Journalism Network, we have attempted to employ this methodology with respect to a lot of things that are happening currently. So we did something on Chinese investments in the Caribbean. We have looked at pyramid schemes, Ponzi schemes that arose during the lockdown period of the pandemic. And as the ongoing project of the MIC, we have been looking at, I'm going to come to that question just a minute, Christopher. We have been looking at state expenditure of multilateral funding in support of the pandemic. And that series has been on track for the past 6 months or so. And we have had reports from 16 different Caribbean countries on the performance, our country's performance with regard to multilateral funding in support of pandemic measures. So we have tried to promote an approach to the practice of investigative journalism in the first place that employs this methodology. So there's a working theme. So we move from the key question or the hypothesis. What would we expect to be the maximum story? What's the minimum story? Just in case things don't work out 100% right and we get many of the questions answered, but not all. what would be the minimum story? What would be the, and I'm going to show you an example of this arising out of two story ideas that emerged out of Freeman's panel last week. What is the working theme? And very loosely, the working theme should be able to be captured in two statements or two sentences. But I like to think headline. So what would be, when I look at this, I think, what would be the prospective headline in the event this story pans out, your hypothesis is proven to whatever degree, what would be the likely working theme or headline that you're working with? But you remember the presentation I made about the difference between news and information. These are not information capsules put out there for public awareness purposes. This is hardcore journalism that's being promoted in order to unveil new information, new perspectives, new approaches to the hypothesis that you have begun the story development with. Now, I know we have people from different newsrooms here, from different parts of the region, Vishmohani, and I see Sigoni here. And you would know that when you sit to discuss the story ideas for the day with the editor, you do cover some of this ground, but it might not be as formalized as it is now. What is the potential impact of both the subject that you're covering and also what would be the potential impact of the story itself? Is the story likely to promote a sense of a need to change? Is the story likely to promote a level of public awareness such that people would start thinking about promoting change, whether it is by official action or private behavior? But all of this will not work unless you have, and the scientists among us, Steve would know, Neville would know, that unless you have the data, unless you have the hard information, then you're basically just residing at a level of hypothesis. And hypothesis is not going to become the reality that you require in order to say that you have a wholesome story. So you need the data. Where do you get the data? You get the data through documentation. So you ask the question, what are the key documents you would need? Where would be these data sets be located? Which agencies will have them? And how long will it take to get them? Somebody wanted to say something? Yep, Christopher Chinapu, yes. In support of my earlier question about justice that raised by Raymond, that justice has nothing to do with law or court. Climate justice is an economic, environmental, social issue driven on inequity and inequalities, driven by actions that have impacts on climate, environment, and powers, disproportionate impacts. Thanks a lot for that, Christopher. So it's not just a matter of court, that even though, as one of the presenters said last week, there might be grounds, and I put in the chat box there, there's a juridical element of this that's emerging, where it might be necessary or it might be possible to take action within the courts to address some of these inequities. And you'll see it's there in a lot of other social justice questions that we confront every day. Gender parity, for example, the rights of people who are otherwise marginalized in our communities. A lot of these things now within this current period is being recognized as being capable of being actioned in courts of law. Because you do have the civil and political rights, but accompanying that economic, social, and cultural rights that are now being increasingly asserted by people and their communities that are otherwise being marginalized. So bear that in mind, that yes, it is not strictly about courts and going to the court and taking an action and suing somebody. Yeah, exactly. shell and so on. And last week we had the issue of the community in Peru, and they were able to successfully challenge the actions of developers and so on. So, and even between countries, at one time, you know, before the ICC became very vogue and so on, you know, and people, there were countries that were repudiating attempts to sort of internationalize this notion of justice and to apply international law. Now, if you look at what's happening in Ukraine, Ukraine never signed on to the ICC. None of the major players have never signed on to the ICC, but suddenly you're seeing this great interest, not only on the part of Ukraine, but countries like the United States that have never exactly. But thanks a lot for this, Christopher. I want you to help us as we go through the storyboards, because the perspectives you are bringing, yes, there is an increasing resort to action within the various jurisdictions, whether international or domestic, that people are seeing an opportunity to address questions of inequity. Because in some instances, like in Caribbean societies, for example, where the LGBTQ rights, for example, are now being actioned, now being addressed via our constitutions by enforcing constitutional guarantees of equal treatment, for example, and a lot of other areas of social justice are being addressed, and people are seeing the courts as being a source of recourse. Good, but getting back to the timeline, because we're going to run out of time. Yeah, the storyboard. Key question would be, who are the players? Who are the main players? And the main players are not only the experts, and we have a lot of experts with us today, and it's good that they're here to sort of fertilize this discussion that we intend to have among journalists, because you're thinking about people who are quote unquote victims, but not only victims, very often you have beneficiaries. You have people who benefit from the inequities because of where they're positioned, because of money, because of influence. So you look at the people who have been affected, the victims, but you also look at the people who are potential beneficiaries. And then you examine who are the people. So you have the data, you have the research, but of course, the most important factor would be the people. Who are the people involved? And then you have all the logistical issues of the timeline. How long will it take? What would be the key components? Because all media now, you no longer have this single track notion of mass media where, okay, I belong to print media, so I'm only concerned about static images, photographs, and graphics. I'm not concerned about audio, I'm not concerned about video. That is changing because you have this convergence of mass media now. So when you're considering the stories, what you're thinking about are the multimedia elements of the story. And I'm appreciating the side discussion going on about the application of law. And international law is becoming increasingly clear, but let's stick to this. What are the web components? Because you also have this convergence of the traditional legacy media and the new media. What you must consider, what are the components that would work on web-based platforms? So those of you who operate in media houses, Vishmohani works on an online medium that began its story, its engagement in media online, but a lot of traditional legacy media resided in the traditional sphere and are now moving into the new media sphere. Some of them much better than others, but one of the things that they need to pay attention to is the web components, or those components of the content that would appear online. So this is another approach to the storyboarding question, and I'm going to take you through this with an actual story, with two actual stories now. But before I continue, are there any questions? And I appreciate the side discussion on climate justice, and Dr. Trotz has spoken authoritatively on it, yes. So yes, it's not necessarily a matter of being actionable in a court of law, but also there are the political dimensions of it, which is the arranged and political in the broad sense of the distribution of power within countries and among countries. But any questions on the storyboard approach that the MIC has been advocating, and which I've taken you through a very quick tour of? Some of you have been through very specific training on this. So you can probably, if you want, chime in on what you have recognized are the benefits of it. I see Dale is here. I see Freeman is here. Esther has been through this before. German, Linda more than once. For sure, I think Raymond, you have attended sessions where we have looked at this, Sherian and so on. It is a methodology that ensures that we don't miss any key component. Yeah, but it's not only, yeah, it totally satisfies print media, but as I said, we have to get out of this, we have to get out of the mindset, because Raymond, it's an important point you're making, and the point you're making is very important for people who have come from traditional media and are now transitioning, using this term transitioning more than once and in different contexts here, who are transitioning from traditional, let's say, print media in your case, to multimedia. But what we are facing now, and I make the point all the time, and I raise the question of my son, who is a digital native, to use a term. I come from the analog era, where basically the thought process was very linear. So you needed to move from A to B to C. Even timelines. If you've done audio or video editing, the timelines were very linear. We did not, years ago when I started in the media, conceive of a situation in which you were able to move from the present to the future, to the back to the past and to the future, so smoothly as digital media now permits. You know, those of us who grew up on free-to-air television would know that when the show done it done, the only opportunity to see what happened at the start or to review what happened at the start was to try to see it again when it came back to television. Then you had videotape, so you were able to rewind and you were able to fast forward and to find your space. Now in the digital sphere, all of these time frames exist at the same time. They're concurrent. Sigoni is talking about the storyboard. She finds it hard to persuade managers to get in the idea of allowing time to work on a story and develop it effectively before publishing. This is a challenge for me to change that mindset. It needs to be ready now versus the story. Of course, Sigoni, it's exactly what we're talking about. That our media formats, I think they will eventually have to change for purposes of survival in the end. But the reality is now that there are very few newsrooms, may I say, if any, outside of the MIC newsroom, and in very well-resourced media in other countries, where they really give you time to flesh out the stories like these, and also to develop timelines for development of the story, as opposed to, well, this story has to appear in the news this evening, or in the newspaper tomorrow morning, or online right now. I think we have some way to go before we reach that point, and it's unfortunate, but I think it's good for us to know, because Sigoni, when you re-emerge as managing editor, in the next year, in the next few years, and we operate within the same media group, then perhaps you would take these ideas to the powers that be, because it is a formula for media success, but it requires investment, and media managers and owners need to understand that you need to invest in order to make. Any other points or questions about this? Maybe from the non-journalists. I know that the scientists will be able to associate exactly, Sigoni, when you take charge. I'm in your corner. The scientists will associate with this very easily because, scientific hypothesis, in order to encourage policymakers, you need to be able to prove your point, and the climate people understand this point very well. So let's try to develop an actual story based on an idea that emerged last week using this methodology. So if I can ever find it, yes, it's here. So I changed the format a little bit so that we can actually do a little bit of typing and development of the story as we go along. We only have time to do maybe 1.5 of these. Thanks a lot, Esther. The storyboard allows you to see beyond the written word and what are the elements you need to make the story real to the reader. Yeah, excellent point, Esther. So let's take one story idea. Now, I did this on my own, and I'm fully going to accept comments on it because I think that this can be developed into a real story. It can be a cross-border story, so we can look between countries and to make certain comparisons. It allows for a lot of the experts who have said that they would be interested in working with us on developing these stories. So let's look at this one story idea. I can't remember who came with the idea, but feel free to chime in either in the chat or interrupt me by using your microphone. So here's the story. The key question or hypothesis. And this came up last week, and during Freeman's session, I want to thank Freeman for keeping the contributors to the point when it came to these issues. And the hypothesis is this, that despite successive destructive impacts from hurricanes, okay, you have these extreme weather events, and we see it getting worse and worse and worse. 2017 being probably an extreme example, but the scientists are saying that we're going to see more and more of that. The hypothesis is this, or the belief, or the question is, Caribbean countries are not, Caribbean governments are not really imposing regulations to strengthen infrastructural resilience in the event of further occurrences of the kind. That may or may not be true in your particular instance, but it's an assertion that we can put out there for interrogation and be posed as a question. The other way, our countries, our governments enacting legislation and regulations to ensure that the infrastructure that's destroyed almost every year and we have to rebuild are done in such a way that they are more resilient to the extreme climate events. And in instances where they are such measures being applied across the board by all of the major players, the developers? In some of our countries, the main developer of infrastructure is the state. So at the height of early warnings about sea level rise, there's one country that I know very, very, very well, where the government boasted of a very expensive shoreline development. Yes. Well, Raymond, we actually have done this sort of thing before, and I would encourage you to stay tuned because the MIC has done this as a specific method of training to look at things in an investigative way. But yes, it is something that we need to say over and over. Okay, so the question is, the questions are, one, are our governments moving to put in place regulations and laws and whatever, building codes or whatever, to ensure that envisage a continuation of these extreme weather events? One question might be yes, question might be yes, but even in instances where it's yes, are these regulations uniformly applied? And I use the word uniformly because I want us to keep in our mind this question of equity and the equal distribution of the challenge and therefore of the resources to address the challenges. So has there been an uneven application of the building requirements? Our governments or our big developers, the wealthy developers who have the money to put up infrastructure, to put up buildings, and different infrastructure, is there an uneven application of the law with respect to them as opposed to everybody else? And I know that some of you are in some countries where these are live issues of the day, but for some reason as journalists, we are just allowed this to reside in the domain of the politics. So a mayor allows certain kinds of construction, and then somebody else from the opposite party say, oh, no. And then we sort of like leave it at that and we report, and that's the end of the story. But there's a very big story associated with this, going back to this whole thing about successive destructive impacts. Now, what is the minimum? If we don't get all the data, we don't get everything, we're not going to drop this story. What would be our minimum story? The minimum story might be, we might be able to report that since 2017, 2018, in some countries we go back a little bit more, 2005, we go back to Ivan and whatever it is. What are the changes in the construction regulations? Have there been any? So that would be the minimum story. But that's a story. You can safely go back to whatever year you had the last significant event, whether it's flooding in different communities in Trinidad and Tobago, whether it is a devastation, Antigua and Barbuda, Dominica, 2017, 2018, you have issues, recurring issues in Haiti, for example. There is a story to be written about what is being done with respect to the imposition of codes for construction, codes for the development of infrastructure. Have there been any changes? The maximum story or the big story has been, has it been so there's this destruction, and then you go back into the status quo. So 2017, 2018, devastation, structures are being rebuilt, but they're being rebuilt with the same brittle, using the same engineering approaches that proved unsuccessful to withstand high wind speeds, rising water, and so on. So then the working theme, or the prospective headline or the prospective thought that would arise among audiences would be that there is complacence even in the face of these severe climate episodes. There is a high level of complacency. So the hurricane come, mash up everything, and we rebuild, but we rebuild exactly as it was before. So 2 years later or the year after. Or are we at the same time, and we might be able to look comparatively, cross-border, look at impacts that we did not readily see ourselves being subject to. And I always talk about Barbados in the face of the volcanic crisis in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, right? Zadie's is the Jamaica example. When do we ask who is responsible for ensuring the infrastructure at international standards? Major road developments in Jamaica to minimize flooding, improve roads, but they're built without proper drainage because supposedly there's no money for drains. Steve saying it goes back to your statement that the rainy season is research in the dry season. The long view, both Zadie and Steve's points look at the long view because we are looking at this in a way that is not for a single story covering a minute and a half in a newscast or half a page in a newspaper. We are looking at a substantial story that interrogates all these questions. Then we have to be looking at all of the examples. So it sometimes, as Zadie says, it might not just be a matter of the regulations because, you know, NEPA might be doing its work. The EMA might be doing its work in Trinidad and Tobago. The environmental management authorities in your various countries might be doing their work in terms of ensuring that there's a sort of regulatory framework. But is it being observed? Is it being applied? Are people being brought the book? Now you're asking that what new ground, because of course, this is journalism. This is not a course at a university. It's not we're not in a classroom setting. This is the real world where we're talking about what's new, what difference will this story make? And this specific story about planning in the face of climate extreme events, weather events, is that you're looking at specific changes in the measures. So there might be a technical point regarding the angle at which people implanting roofs in their houses, or the roof in the various things, or the height above ground. The scientists, those people who are involved in looking at these things in a scientific way, will be able to tell you the specification. So what might be new is that nobody in the public sphere might have thought about this, you know, but maybe the angle, the reason why the roofs keep flying off every time there's a high wind is that the angle and the material used and the weight of this. So you might be able, even as a journalist, a non-specialist, be able to bring to the fore a point. Has this report been reported before? Well, there is quite a lot that's been reported on. Every time there is a major event in the region, in the Caribbean region, you have agencies like SIDEMA, SEHI now under the cover of CAFA that look at different things. So they look at the scale of damage. So at the end of a hurricane season, SIDEMA and others put together these things. What was the extent of the displacement? So the extent of displacement might refer to the number of people who had to move from one community to the next. In the case of Barbuda, as we said last week, there was a depopulation of the island. Now there's a repopulation. What's the nature of this repopulation? Is there a case to be made about land grabbing and opportunism by the part of people who are seeing prime real estate with nice beaches, as opposed to people who are seeing an island where people can live and their children can go to school and people can carry on their life as a civilization. But we often can find the data or the information in its very raw form in terms of dollars, in terms of the numbers of people, in terms of the dollars, the cost of the reconstruction. Those figures are usually, we would do the story. So a government official says, well, the country suffered X billion dollars in damage from hurricane season 2017. We know that has already been reported. But have we really drilled down? Have we looked at issues such as the prospects for the recovery, not only of the physical infrastructure, but of the social infrastructure? We're also asking the question, what is the potential impact? Why should somebody care about this story? Well, one, we should care about it because in the case of severe weather events, we are in it. We can't say we're going to pick up our island and go somewhere else where at hurricane season, there tends to be an accumulation of warm water that attracts these high winds and rainfall. Another impact is that putting out a story like this can serve as a regional alert on the question of disaster preparedness. And we can go here. I want to go into the other story because I'm running out of time and Kiran is going to slap me on my knuckles just now. What are the data? Because again, this is akin to the scientific inquiry. So the data, what's the hard information? Indisputable. We can say this is what the law looked like in 2015. This is what it looked like now. What has changed? Have there been changes in the penalties? For example, in this instance, or long-standing building codes, did they change the penalties for departing from the building codes? What are the new laws or regulations that were introduced? I remember going into Grenada following Hurricane Ivan, and you look at the devastation, and I remember one person saying, well, boy, you realize that is back to square one when this we're building, because, and then you visit the island years later, and you see, yes, where building A once stood, there is now building C, but it looks exactly like building A. Maybe there's something in the engineering that strengthened it, but it seems to the naked eye that it's the same building that has been rebuilt, and so it's back to the status quo. The value of the new infrastructure, changes in insurance, the insurance sector. I said last week that when we did this sectoral look at the impact of climate change on the various sectors, the regional insurance industry appeared pretty clueless. Now there's quite a lot of awareness on the part of the insurance sector because of the impact of reinsurance and the fact that the reinsurance industry is becoming more and more restrictive and difficult for our domestic or regional insurance sector because their premiums are increasing, and therefore you will have impacts on insurance premiums even for domestic householders and so on. The key documents, the laws, billing codes, regional decisions, CDEMA, CARICOM. I think we have CDEMA on the call today. Which agencies will have these things? Parliament, government ministries, CDEMA, multilateral agencies. And during our investigation of the pandemic management, what we have found is that a lot of the multilateral agencies are very open in terms of providing some of the information. So if you go to the World Bank, for example, if there is World Bank support for projects in your country, the World Bank has an internal policy of transparency so that you will be able to investigate to find out where that money went and what it was meant for. And you can do the comparison between what has happened at the ground. And then you have the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility, CRIF. I think we have CCRIF folks here, right? So look, a number of the sources are right here with us on this call today and will be before the end of our sessions on Thursday. So get these people's contact information if you're interested in pursuing this story. Who are the key players? Governments. We tend to look at government. And the panel, the note I sent to our panel that's on Thursday morning is that there's this tendency to look at government, but isn't there a role for private sector, and they involved? And those building contractors part of the story? When they submit their tenders for these public contracts, what are the parameters they're setting for the reinforcement of infrastructure, for the erection of new structures and so on? There's a role for the financial sector. Are our commercial banks encouraging and financing slackness? Are the priorities of the commercial banking sector in keeping with some of these requirements? What about the insurance sector? We have to keep our eyes on them because they play a key role in terms of the recovery process. And then you go through the whole logistics with this timeline, with the storyboard. I have one more example. If I may have to steal a few minutes from the next session. Kiran, if you don't mind. And I'm going to bring up the other story idea. Right, which is this one. Now we had, as I said, about a dozen story ideas. And Esther, we haven't forgotten your stories, just that I decided to choose 2 at random because all of them were very important and very interesting. This one has to do with food. And it inspired a lot by a lot of what Steve Maximi has been talking about and Dr. Trotz has spoken about. And the MIC, we have done this look at the food sector in the face of the pandemic, but there is a strong case for keeping our eyes on what happens to the food sector. Note I'm saying food and not necessarily agriculture, because as the experts will say, not all agriculture is about food for us. Not all of agriculture is about what is described as nutrition security. So not only are we getting food to fill our bellies, but we're getting food that will help keep us healthy. And the pandemic has stressed this because the role of comorbidities in terms of the ability of people to survive the pandemic is emphasized everywhere we have seen the pandemic impacted on us. So has climate change worsened the prospects for the region to address what is a huge imbalance between the food we grow to consume on our own and the food that we import? This is just a hypothesis. I'm just throwing it out there. Is there a question to be asked along those lines? Steve, was there something you think is conceivable that climate change can play a role in terms of worsening the imbalance or affecting the imbalance?
Most definitely, Wesley. I mean, we could take 6 hours to talk about that one.
Yep, exactly.
That's a resounding yes.
Okay, so and then if you insert the climate justice component, if this is a possibility, a likelihood, is there going to tend to be an uneven impact regionally between countries? Because there are some countries that are clearly better equipped to promote a notion of providing more food, will never, in many instances, have enough food. I think it's myth in some instances to say that we can grow all the food that we need, because considering when it's not only food to fill your belly, as I said, but food to help remain healthy, there are going to be uneven impacts across borders, Guyana, Suriname, Trinidad, St. Kitts, wherever you are, St. Vincent and the Grenadines. It's going to be uneven between countries, but it's also going to be uneven among social sectors. So that if there is this imbalance and you continue importing food, now we are seeing the impact not only of the pandemic, but we have the impact of the Russian invasion of Ukraine that's having some kickback in terms of supply of things like wheat. Not all of our countries rely on European wheat as heavily as the others. Some rely on other sources, but in instances where you have this heavy reliance, there are going to be price impacts. And if there are price impacts, we are dealing with countries in which there are inequities. So people who can afford and people who cannot afford. And that's where the whole issue of social justice comes in. So because you can't afford, is it that you're going to have less nutritional food at your disposal because of this change in the dynamic between food that you're able to grow and food that you're able to import? At one time, the notion of food security hinged around an ability to acquire the food that you need, whether you grew it on your own or whether you had the money to pay for it. And I've lived to see that a sort of change and Steve is one of the regional experts in this, so he can explain it much better than I can, which is that there is a reorienting of this notion of food security. It has now morphed into a notion of nutrition security. So you see all the different angles. Even though we're dealing with climate change and climate justice, there's an angle that relates to food, and there is direct relevance now, particularly as we're facing a pandemic occasioned by a virus that's targeting the vulnerable disproportionately vis-a-vis those people who are healthier, who are not prone to have different comorbidities. So climate change, the persistence of both, we live in a region where you have water scarce countries, Antigua and Barbados. You have those that are a little bit short on the amount of water that they need for all their purposes, whether it's industry, whether it's for your home, whether it's for agriculture, whatever. That the dynamics among countries are different, and therefore there's an uneven impact if you have more rainfall or less rainfall. Even in countries that are not water scarce, you have issues of the ability to generate sufficient supplies of potable water so that people can turn their taps on 24/7 and be assured that water is going to flow, that's not going to cause a disease or kill them. The maximum impact climate changes and climate require reforming of the food sector that countries appear unwilling or unable to execute. It might well be that your country is unable to execute it. It's unable to advance the cause of food security for all kinds of different reasons. But it needs to be explored. It needs to move beyond the political platform where an opposition party says this and the government responds and there's a thing and somebody decides they want to be Chris Rock and they don't want to be Will Smith. No, the story has to focus on what are the meaningful issues that are capable of generating more inequity as opposed to less inequity, so that the poor and the vulnerable and the disadvantaged and the marginalized are not made to starve or to fall below the nutritional requirements for them to have healthy livelihoods. So the working theme might well be, is climate change a road to hunger? Some sensational. It might be that you need to tweak that in keeping with the findings, but it is a worthwhile question to be asked. So I hope through all of this, you have been able to capture the kind of approach that we're looking at. This is aimed at a kind of journalism that is investigative and that interrogates. It's not necessarily friendly to all of the players. It's not going to be friendly to the politicians. It probably won't be friendly to some of the scientists, because you'll find even in the scientific community, there might be variances in opinions, and the reasons for this might go straight back to the politics. I see a lot of public commentary in some of our countries here related to the food sector, and you kind of like, you could put 2 and 2 together and know exactly where they're coming from in terms of the power dynamic in their countries, and in terms of whether they see the points being made capable of earning them votes or not. What we need really is a journalism that looks beyond that and that interrogates these questions almost in the way that the scientists would, that would be heavily reliant on a wholesome hypothesis that looks at something that's current, that's capable of breaking news, new information, that bringing to the light new information, and that's capable because of the strength of the arguments raised and the narrative that's being proposed to bring about the kind of change that would address the problems that have arisen. It is not that we are going to be, as I said last week, and some people didn't agree with me, that we're going to be out on a demonstration holding a placard saying A, B, or C. We are doing our work in the same way that the scientists see themselves as putting their shoulders to the wheel and doing their work by looking at verifiable data and information, by relying on independent scientific sources that have been themselves interrogated, and producing stories that take into account the reality of our changing Caribbean landscape. So I think that the plan is that we will have an editorial committee that will go through all these various story ideas and come up with a selection of them and constitute teams. So Kiran will probably be able to expand more on that, but I hope that that my points have been made and that you go away with a different idea of what the MIC proposes as a methodology for story development. Thank you.
Thanks, Wesley. We have some time for a few questions. Any questions before I explain a little bit more about the grants, the historians?
Hi, good
Wesley,
morning.
that was excellent. There is one storyline that promotes the evolving role of our regional institutions that I think the media could pursue in terms of activism in these institutions. You mentioned two of the key ones: the insurance sector and the development banks, who basically can play a tremendous role in terms of transition that the Caribbean and the rest of the globe will have to go through. Another one that is hardly visible and I think needs promotion are national meteorological offices, which up to now are looked at as just a sideline to tell you every morning, sunny with a few showers, etc. But in many countries, their role as a key institution in development, applications right now, for instance, in the agricultural sector, in the water sector, tourism sector, energy sector, the important role and the need for governments basically to resource these institutions. So I think this is a useful theme in terms of something that the media can promote, that is making the public and these institutions, particularly insurance and development banks. I've always questioned the D in development, in the acronym of our development banks, because we have found over the years in the region that they are risk averse and they operate just like, normal commercial banks. But all these have to change. And I think the media can do a really great job in pushing them over that line.
Thanks for
For
that.
that.
I see Carson Greenwich. Carson, go right ahead, please.
Hi, good morning. Hi, good morning, Leslie. Thank you so much again for sharing that session on storyboarding. I'd love the opportunity to rewatch it again, and I'd place a question in the chat. I'm wondering how soon, because there was so much and it's a learning opportunity too as well, how soon would the recording of your session, can it be made available?
By the end of the week. By the end of the week, it'll be available. The other two are already up. I'll ask Tanika to put the YouTube link in the chat so that you all could hold on to it. And please follow please follow our social media pages, because we usually post any information and links there as well. I'm going to give Steve 1 minute before I explain the process of the story submission. Steve?
It's just a comment that occurred to me. Wesley, great presentation as usual. How important is it for journalists to see themselves as part of this story? In the sense that when I discuss labor changes and just transition in labor in various job categories, journalism never comes up. I was wondering, how how interesting that would be for you to turn the binoculars or the microscope on yourselves and see how this whole fraternity has been impacted by the just transition that we are supposed to be making right now. Thanks.
But I think, Steve, I mean, the combined efforts of the ACM and the MIC provide an opportunity for us to look inward. And as you would know, we do quite a lot of introspection. ACM has just completed a report, a State of the Caribbean Media report, where we ask these kinds of questions because we are part of the landscape. As you've said, I mean, it's inescapable. And I think that the quality of journalism has had an impact on the quality of both official and private intervention and how people have responded. So there are those of us who are perpetually in touch with colleagues within the profession say, but you know, what was that? What was that? You know, really were the Oscars as important as A, B, or C? So why is it number 1 in the newscast and not number 10? I mean, I've been there, so I understand the challenges. I understand because the thing is that newsrooms are not necessarily the best example of democracies themselves. So, so yes, I absolutely agree with you that we are part of the story and we need to conduct some introspection. I think that these sessions that we have under the ambit of MIC and that we do ACM provide a platform for us to do that.
Thanks. Okay, Zadie, I'll take yours and then we'll move along.
Okay, thank you, Kiran. I was just wondering, I'd like to ask Dr. Trotz because he's very familiar with this. Sea coral is used to train people in development. And I wonder how useful it would be to media people, you know, personnel, in letting them understand how and what questions they could ask in these development processes. You know, how do you build something and why do you not apply certain standards, etc. I just want to ask that question.
Okay, sea coral is a climate change online risk and adaptation tool that the center has developed, and we've been training right across the region, different stakeholders, particularly those involved in planning and governments, etc., to use the tool. What it does basically is for any activity that is going to be undertaken, the user will be able to identify whether that activity would be exposed to climate risk, and if it's necessary really to address that risk in the planning cycle. For the media, really it could be you know, it will help basically for you to ask more incisive questions about some of the decisions that government make about development. You will be able to say, look, you know, this, as far as I'm concerned, there is a climate risk. Have you addressed it? The tool goes further because it then allows the technical people to dive into a toolbox to do the different analysis they need to come up with basically a solution or something that has to be implemented to deal with that risk. But in terms of raising your ability to spot where due diligence needs to be taken, you know, building a road, putting in new infrastructure, etc., questions that should be asked, at least you'll be armed with that knowledge that these things should have been done, and you can then pose the question publicly, asking if they have been considered.
Okay, thanks for that, Dr. Trotz. Some questions quickly from Mr. Christopher Chinapu. Actually, he brings some, a nice perspective here. He says, will greater focus on issues of climate justice and other sustainable development issues require changes in ethical frameworks.
Well, and I think Christopher followed up with a very, very interesting question on the new competencies and capacities that journalists will have to develop, because those are very fundamental questions. I think sticking on my theme of good journalism will always prevail. That the whole issue of news values and what constitutes a qualification to be part of the news agenda of an issue, the qualification of an issue to become part of the news agenda, the classical criteria ought to apply. The issue of climate change, or the climate crisis as I prefer to describe it, and the ensuing demands on climate justice are fully in keeping with news agendas and what we consider to be the news values of things around us. But what will be required because of our exposure to the realities now is a reorienting of the news agendas in terms of what do we see as top of the news agenda as opposed to what we see as lower down on the news agenda. Make no joke, be clear about this. The climate crisis is a survival issue. So in the same way that everything else is dropped at the height of a hurricane, at the height of a volcanic crisis, at the height of an earthquake, everything else fades into the background in exchange for news reporting on those things that would help us survive the crisis, get out of the crisis, find refuge. That's what, and the climate crisis ought to help us reorient the news agenda fully in keeping with traditional news values. Traditional news values have always placed a premium on surviving, on the people, your audiences prevailing, on you as a media house thriving. So we need, in any event, the media sector in the Caribbean, and Kiran is a key player in all of that, is looking at the question of business models and reorienting business models, not only in the face of the survival needs of our societies, but in the context of the survival of media, the viability of media. They've just done an extensive study on media viability in the Caribbean. And that's when you say you're studying media viability, what you're really discussing is the survival of the media as we know it in the region, all things considered. So Christopher, right on the button, those are fundamental questions.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Wesley. So folks, just to quickly give you a little insight before we move on to our next speaker, Dr. Trotz. One is that the story ideas, I have placed the email address in the chat, micstoryideas@gmail.com. Please submit your story ideas. There is a deadline, I believe it's April 20th, but you're going to get a formal email, all of you who are here for this meeting. And you can submit the story ideas. The process is that once the story idea is received, the editorial committee, and the editorial committee will be comprised of about 5 people, not just regionally, but outside of the region as well, who have a background in the issue, and some of whom are journalists for much larger international organizations, as well as we would have some of our own on that committee. They will go through, they will look at all of the story ideas. We will then be reaching out to every journalist who has submitted, because there may be some questions for us to understand your approach, because we don't have a wishing well full of money, unfortunately. We do have funding, but it's limited. So then we're going to drill down on which story ideas we feel are going to be the best, which are best suited from a multimedia perspective as well. So please visit cijn.org if you want to better understand how we present our stories with the multimedia effects. And then once we select the stories, we then start, and everything will be due. You'll have a month, you'll have 4 weeks. It'll be due within a month. One of the things that we've seen has helped advance our journalists who have story ideas is the use of the storyboard. So right now, once you are selected, you're going to have to do the storyboard to be able to continue because that is going to help the mentor and or the editor who will be working with you to be able to help give direction and provide advice in the best way possible. Our model is that the administrative aspect is what we help with. So MIC, in terms of helping you write your letters, get them out, do the follow-up, we have an administrative help desk, and you will have somebody from the administrative team assigned to help you with that regard. And then in terms of multimedia, when we help you define your budget, there will be consideration for the multimedia elements, okay? And then, of course, you are given an honorarium for your time and effort. So that is really how it works. And of course, we will be hearing from you all, and we know some good stuff is going to come about. You can do them as individual stories, or you may choose to do them as a team, whether it's 2 people, 3 people, 4 people, and you want to do it either regionally or for your country. All of that is open. We are not putting any limitations with regards to how best you think the story should be handled. We want to empower you guys to think through that process on your own, to make those determinations on your own, okay? So that is a little bit on what we're doing. Wesley mentioned the media viability. I guess I could say it because UNESCO has signed off. Media Institute of the Caribbean was very happy that we were asked to do the pilot study for this media viability indicators developed by UNESCO. So again, we stood out there because this is help set a global standard for how countries all over the world are going to use media viability indicators, and we chose to do the study on Jamaica. So that report is going to be released in World Press Freedom Week, and you will be seeing a lot of publicity around it. But I think it was great. It was written by a colleague in Jamaica and myself, and we went through over 120 hours of interviews and material and so on. So it will be very detailed. So that's on those 2 things. So thank you all again for all of your questions, and I hope to see those story ideas coming in. We're going to move into our next session now with Dr. Alright Trots, a gentleman who you've heard from before here, and somebody who is definitely no stranger to the area of climate justice. For those of you who are meeting him for the first time via this seminar, let me tell you that he has an illustrious career when it comes to the issue of climate justice. He served in several capacities, including that in his experience as Deputy Director and Science Advisor of the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center in Belize. He is a scientist by training, and he has a doctorate in organic chemistry. His career and achievements vary too as Director of Science and Technology Division, Commonwealth Secretariat. He was Secretary of the Commonwealth Science Council and Science Advisor to the Commonwealth Secretary General, Secretary General of the National Science Research Council in Guyana. He was Dean of the Faculty of Sciences at UG, University of Guyana, Director of Institute of Applied Sciences and Technology in Guyana. And he has also managed the GEF-funded CPACC and MACC projects. And he's going to talk to us about policy framework. And I know that we get very confused as journalists when we hear all of the acronyms. And Dr. Trotz is going to help us to not just understand the policy framework and why we have all of these institutions, but I think very often we don't understand why certain things are not happening as quickly or why there are delays. And I think policy framework helps give the, sets the tone for all of that and for us to understand what needs to be done for this to keep going so we can have success. So Dr. Trotz, thank you for being here with Media Institute of the Caribbean. Again, I hand over to you, understanding the policy framework.
Thank you very much, Kiran, and good morning, everybody. I wonder if that slide, you could just in any way increase the font. Hello?
No, I don't believe so, Dr.
Okay.
Trotz.
Hopefully the next slide will be easier, Dr. Trotz.
All right.
This is your next
try,
slide.
You know,
So-
y'all are dealing with a very senior citizen here. You know, the eyes aren't as good as they used to be. Anyway, this morning, what I'll try to do is to show how the Caribbean, basically, in terms of policy issues, how these have evolved over the years. And I must say that the Caribbean position really is reflected in AOSIS's policy positions over the years. We've been a leader in terms of molding positions under the convention since it started. And most recently, the Indian Ocean and Pacific Island partners have not been as active and vocal as they were earlier, and the Caribbean has found itself more or less catapulted in a leadership role as far as defining the situation and the position of small island development states globally. CARICOM was a founding member of AOSIS, and as I said, they played a very major role in developing and defending the negotiation positions of SIDS. When we are drafting the climate change convention during the early part of the 90s, a lot of the focus, as if you look at that, the language in the convention was on mitigation. We were not as aware of the importance for us in terms of adaptation until much later in the discussions. And basically, the focus was having all efforts made globally to curtailing emissions of greenhouse gases. And we are even presumptuous enough to put as an objective under that convention, when it was adopted in 1992, that the target for global emissions of greenhouse gases, the target was for global emissions of greenhouse gases to return to the 1990 levels by the year 2000. Well, you know that did not happen. In fact, as a mechanism for achieving this, they had an agreement called the Kyoto Protocol. The Kyoto Protocol allowed developed countries to invest in mitigation activities in developing countries and take credit for that in terms of their global effort to reduce their own carbon footprint. Unfortunately, a big player, America, did not form part of that the Kyoto Protocol, and it did not work as we would have expected. It fell way below expectations. So we struggled along, and early in this in the year 2000, early in that century, I forgot we were in a new century now. In the 21st century, we started to realize a few things. First of all, that the agreement that we had under the convention needed to be revisited. And it was obvious that we would have a new agreement. We were hoping that this would be adopted in 2009 in Copenhagen. It was during these years that I think as developing countries realized that climate change was going to be with us for a very long time, that the world was committed to a changing climate, and that we were starting to experience the bad end of climate change impacts. We started to realize that whatever we did to curb greenhouse gases, we would need to adapt. And that is when we started the campaign to get adaptation, to give it equal visibility in the convention as mitigation. We also started to realize that the 2-degree limit that was the consensus in terms of curbing the global temperature rise to 2 degrees wasn't something that we could accept, and that 1.5 really was the limit as far as the Caribbean was concerned. This, of course, was informed by the science at the time when I can't remember his name, one of the leading American scientists in the negotiations said that the fact that we were talking about curbing greenhouse gases in the future is really a non-starter, because as far as he was concerned, we are at the limit, approaching the limit, which would be 1.5 that we need to aim at. And we took up that ball and basically ran with it and made sure that we went to Copenhagen armed with the 1.5 to stay alive principle. The next slide, please. This basically shows how our policy positions evolved for the COP. Adaptation was critical. We also started to introduce this issue of loss and damage, because for slow onset events like sea level rise, coastal erosion, we felt that no amount of the adaptation would lead us to recover all that we would have lost. And we were arguing since then for compensation for that. The big issue, of course, was the question of finances, not only finances for adaptation, but finances for loss and damage. And this finance issue is based simply on the policy of attrition. We are saying that, look, you people have basically over the years during the Industrial Revolution, you're the reason why we're in the position we are in. Our input into the global greenhouse gas budget is minimal, but we, being where we are geographically in the Caribbean, and given our social sort of structure or poverty, etc., we are going to be suffering. And in many cases, we were regarded as the canary in the mine as far as climate change impacts are concerned. So you should have a responsibility for providing us with the resources to help us to recover. So that was one of the first kind of moral and you might say arguments for some sort of justice, climate justice, as we deal with climate change impacts. As early as those days, basically, we had, apart from loss and damage, we also were calling for new mechanisms, particularly the establishment of an insurance mechanism to address the impacts of sea level rise. This wasn't accomplished except for a cursory mention of insurance in one of the articles of the convention, but there's no commitment basically to that type of institutional arrangement to help us to cope. During the course, we had some very interesting battles. When we were talking about mitigation, for instance, the OPEC countries led by Saudi Arabia argued that, okay, we would agree to mitigation, but the convention has to have language to compensate us for the loss of income that would arise from a world moving off of fossil fuels. Even when we put forward the 1.5 aspiration to the convention, we got a pushback from OPEC, and it's only recently, I would say at Glasgow, that they basically gave a bit of ground and sort of dropped their demands for the type of compensation that would see them rewarded for the loss of revenue in a world that moves away from fossil fuel. Next slide.
Dr. Trotz, it's stuck. Just give me a few seconds.
Okay.
And while Fazlet is dealing with that, I saw that Jackson had a question. Steve?
Go ahead.
While Jackson's question, Neville, do you see the similarities between the payments made by the British to slave owners in terms of the
reparation
request from OPEC? You know, here you have the major perpetrators looking to be rewarded in the same way that slave owners were rewarded after slavery. But as I said, that's just
there is a parallel, and it's immoral.
Yep, it is.
I don't accept it at all. No, this one is, yeah, that's a little better. Now, yeah. Now, let's move very quickly from EOSIS to the Caribbean. And as I say, we need to basically be proud of the fact that before Copenhagen, our region, our heads of government outlined certain principles in terms of what we'd like to see in any new agreement. Of course, I read this, all parties to work with a sense of urgency. Wesley, you see this question of urgency comes up again, and purpose towards arriving at an ambitious and comprehensive agreement at COP15 in Copenhagen for long-term stabilization of greenhouse gas concentrations at levels which will ensure that global average surface temperature increase will not exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial values, and that global greenhouse gas emissions should peak by 2015, and carbon dioxide reductions there should be carbon dioxide reductions by more than 95% levels by 2050. When you look at what we are asking for now for 2050, this isn't far off. It means phasing out, this zero carbon situation by 2050. So since 2009, the Caribbean had defined a position. The next was prioritization of adaptation and capacity building for adaptation and mitigation, financial support to enhance capacities to respond to challenges, including modalities for risk sharing and insurance, which we haven't realized up to now, a multi-window insurance facility to address immediate, urgent, as well as projected impacts on vulnerable countries, especially SIDS and LDCs. That hasn't materialized. Whenever there's a question of resources, there's discussion, but no support. Luckily for the Caribbean, we have CRIF, the Caribbean Catastrophic Risk Insurance Facility, which is it's the insurance scheme that helps the Caribbean, particularly after extreme events. It gives support to their recovery activities. Streamlining all climate change funding mechanisms and adaptation of a vulnerability index as a basis of qualification for access for grant funding and concessional loans. We experienced this in the Caribbean, even over the years of the center operating. Many of the donor funds that we got, we weren't able to carry out the actions in certain countries because they are designated as middle income countries and thus not eligible. We fought for that, and there is a lot of work, particularly out of Malta under the Commonwealth Secretariat, looking at a new definition, the vulnerability index. I had a very rich experience in this discussion in Samoa years ago, when we were talking about this transition of countries in the region to middle income status. This guy said, look, here we are in a small group. Just imagine we are LDCs, least developing countries, at the bottom of the round. And tomorrow, Bill Gates moves in and becomes a citizen. He said, immediately, we're middle to upper income countries. And the question, GDP per capita is no real metric of the social and economic status of countries. Income distribution is an important metric, and that is not taken into consideration. It's badly skewed in our countries, and so we've still been pushing for the vulnerability index as part of the way in which our countries would be identified to access grant funding and concessional funding as we go through the transition. Next slide, please. The other thing that we put in the agenda is this whole question of reduced emissions from forest degradation and forest destruction. So the whole question of ecosystem services from mangroves, from standing forests, is now encapsulated, as we will see, in the Paris Agreement. So I wouldn't go through the what the Paris Agreement is about, but in terms of CARICOM, these are three, I think, of the outstanding issues that we have to address. And the first, of course, is closing the emissions gap, achieving the 1.5 target in a timely fashion. As you know, all of our countries have been asked to articulate what are known as nationally determined contributions, which is a report on what your country is going to do about mitigation. When the convention asked for NDCs, in the first instance, they were intended national determined contributions. There was no commitment for action. Now, the first call was really about mitigation. And subsequently, for the NDCs that we have to prepare now, they have asked for adaptation actions. As far as I'm concerned, all these reports we've been writing for the convention, what we are about to do, what we plan to do, are just expressions of intent. And our challenge is to transform these documents into portfolios of projects for implementation with feasibility studies, costs, etc. And enough of this reporting. As it's time for action, that really should be our mantra at this point in time. The other one, of course, is, the one other thing about the NDCs is that they've collected all the NDCs globally. And when they have done the analysis, it shows that it falls woefully short of the targets that we have set. And this is the reason you hear the term increased ambition. They've asked countries now to revisit these, to talk about greater action on the mitigation, etc. The next one is the stickiest thorn in the whole thing as far as we're concerned, adaptation and financial resources for adaptation. As I said, and I think was the last time I spoke on this, it's not that we don't know what to do. It's just that we don't have the resources to do it. I referred to the case of Holland, where they have the resources to put in our flood risk system, mitigation system, for a 1 in 1,000 year extreme event, flooding event. Whereas in countries like ours, we don't even have the money to put in the protection for a yearly recurring event. That's how bad we are. And of course, the big issue, the really big issue, is the whole question of loss and damage, which was introduced at the in the Paris Agreement. There was a commitment to develop a work program, basically to deal with it in a financial mechanism. And up to now, we are still struggling. There's a lot of definition of action and whatnot, but there are no resources for us to pursue the action that we've articulated. Next slide, please. Now, this is CARICOM position, and I share with you the declaration on climate change made by CARICOM. And it's worthwhile to go through this. It says the region faces a climate emergency and unavoidable loss and damage. We call urgently for unswerving global solidarity to deliver ambition, timely action, and support, your language now again, Steve, for a just transition this decade, with the aim of limiting global warming to well below 1.5 degrees centigrade. You don't need a clearer statement than that. We demand climate justice and the assurance that our survival will not be compromised. We call upon leaders of COP26 to close the emissions gap. This was just before Glasgow. Scale up, close the emissions gap, scale up finance, particularly for the most vulnerable, and agree on rules to guide parties to progressively increase and demonstrate the highest ambitions. And they actually made suggestions about closing the emissions gap. Urgently close the emissions gap to maintain global warming to well below 1.5, deliver well below the global stock take in next year. New NDCs, this stock take will look at the NDCs, the actions that are proposed, and say whether we are on a track to achieve the 1.5 goal. Again, that are consistent with 1.5 degree temperature goal. Support efforts to bring on aviation and shipping sectors because they have been excluded up to now from the equation in terms of going green. Provide fair and just compensation for ecosystem services And this will come up with an Article 6, which I'll talk about shortly, regarding climate and atmospheric regulations, and ensure green and sustainable approach to the recovery for COVID-19 pandemic. So our region was way ahead of the game. They also called for, this is about finance. First, rapid access to grants and other sustainable and affordable financial instruments. And I quoted the fact that in 2015, we put forward a regional coral restoration project to the Green Climate Fund. And up to now, we haven't had an agreement from that fund. This is 7 years later. And every day you can read about what sea surface temperatures and ocean acidification is doing to our reefs, what it's doing to as a result of fisheries, what it's doing as a result to the livelihoods of our fisherfolk. The CARICOM rapid access, improved modalities for access. We thought that we had that with the establishment of the Green Climate Fund, which operates on the principle of what they call direct access, which means regional institutions can directly access from the fund for implementation of projects which they supervise and are responsible for. Previously, those funds came to us through the IFCs, through the World Bank, through the IDB, through the UNDP, who imposed their own sort of perspectives on things that we wanted to implement. So we have that modality in place. Simplified approved procedures. The GCF have attempted to do that, but still they're not simplified. They're approved, but they're not simplified. It's still a tortuous labyrinth of bureaucracy that we have to go through to get a few pennies to implement the smallest of projects. Regional efforts to develop, and I think, you know, as I have the media here, these are a couple of things that we should talk about, not only about our regional arrangements and our regional institutions, but the global arrangements that frustrate the efforts of regional institutions to address these issues. You know, a kind of shaming game. Bring it to the forefront. It's not, they always tend to point fingers at us and say how we don't have the capacity and we basically are disorganized, etc. That's nonsense. In a lot of cases, the restrictions come at the level of the donor. Regional efforts to develop capacity and access fit for purpose, state-of-the-art technology to improve and accelerate responses to climate change. Dedicated funds for adaptation and loss and damage for SIDS. And as part of this financial package, debt forgiveness, debt relief, and increased liquidity for the region. I think there is a debt swap. I can't remember which country has entered into one, where debt is basically not forgiven, but instead of paying back on the debt, the funds are sunk into a local arrangement that would address climate change, adaptation, or mitigation. To close the finance gap, they called for delivering their goal of at least US 100 billion in Cancun. The announcement was made that they're going to provide 100 billion per year for mitigation and adaptation. We argue that it should be equal split, 50 million each way, 50 billion each way, but that 100 billion looks big. But when you look at the costs alone of adaptation that we would have to face, it's a drop in the proverbial bucket. And we are now asking that they revisit that amount and to basically increase the floor of that $100 billion per annum. That will include a specific target to significantly increase finance for SIDS in accordance with our needs and modalities for fast-track financing in keeping with the emergency we face. You see, the question of time comes again. Ensure that all CARICOM member states are able to access climate finance as grants and other concessionary instruments. There are attempts now to introduce a lot of instruments where they're trying to force us to get loans for adaptation. And we are pushing back on that really, really seriously. Mitigation is a different matter. You see, for mitigation, that's an investment. It's an investment that pays back, because by changing the architecture of the energy sector to renewables, what you save can easily pay for the investment for the change. Not so adaptation. A lot of time for adaptation, we're talking about regional public goods. And as a result, when you talk about the private sector supporting that, it's a much more difficult sell. So concessionary finance basically has to remain at the top of our ladder when we are looking for funds, international funds, to support our adaptation efforts. And of course, addressing the replenishment of the adaptation fund, which is accompanying fund. There are three mechanisms now under the convention. There's still the GF, there's the adaptation fund, and there is the Green Climate Fund, which is the biggest. Interestingly enough, I should share with you that we had applied years ago for accreditation to the Adaptation Fund so that we could approach it directly on behalf of countries. And we've been negotiating, and still we have not been accredited. Ad interim, we applied for the accreditation by the Green Climate Fund. And we've had that now for the last 4 or 5 years. And we're still negotiating with the Adaptation Fund for them to decide that we are a credible institution capable of managing the funds that they disburse. That's just an aside. Now, very quickly, other issues, again, we introduced this Article 6, which basically allows for countries like Guyana, Suriname, Belize to use their standing forest and sequestration capacity of ecosystems to basically get funds for maintaining carbon sinks. There are lots of rules involved. And of course, the Caribbean and AOSIS have been at the front line basically to getting these defined. One of the problems is that countries like Norway, for instance, would pay Guyana for standing forests, and they would claim that basically as part of their contribution to reducing their own carbon footprint. But it's important at the same time that Guyana doesn't claim the same reduction as part of their contribution to the global budget. Now, these are just technical issues. The more one thing I need to the last one, to expand capacity building support, capacity building support for SIDS and LDCs, especially for generating data and for reporting and support needed and received. What is happening? They're introducing all these new modalities, and we are pleading for resources to ensure that we are part of the parcel of the entire rollout of these new modalities, and that we are not left at a disadvantage simply because we didn't have the capacity to define how we participate in these new modalities. We could move on. Now, I have to share this with you because the last part of that declaration states as follows. Finally, we recall that 30 years ago, SIDS raised the issue of loss and damage and the need, therefore, for international cooperation to prevent dangerous anthropogenic climate change. 30 years later, we are facing dangerous climate change, and the SIDS are dangerously on its front line. Clearly, the models have not worked, and there must now be renewed effort, renewed commitment, and a different way of thinking. And most importantly, we urge all leaders at COP26, this was, mind you, the Glasgow meeting, to finally confront the reality of loss and damage in SIDS and to identify robust options on a way forward for the UNFCCC to deliver action and support that corresponds to this reality and ensures our survival. We emphasize that there is no more time for equivocation and no more time for delay. I repeat that. We emphasize that there is no more time for equivocation and no more time for delay. You know, I recall that in 1992, I had the distinct honor of being part of the West Indian Commission, which was headed by Sir Sridhar Ramphal. And the report of that exercise, the title was Time for Action. It would be interesting if you revisit that. 1992, 30 years later, you'll see that many of the recommendations that were made in terms of moving CARICOM forward, with CSME, etc., they have not been implemented. So, you know, it's not only at the global level we find this equivocation, but also nationally, regionally. Next slide. Now, to show you how much our political directorate is on top of this issue, earlier this year, they met here in Belize, in Ambergris-Key, and they had a declaration. This is the declaration. This is part of their declaration. Desiring that 2022, desiring thus for 2022, and this is basically preparing the way for the next COP this year, which is going to be held in Cairo, to initiate a roadmap from ambition to action. Enough of saying expressions of intent. It's now time for action, with milestones for governments and non-state actors alike, with COP27 as our first waypoint on the path to 1.5 degrees centigrade, the the CARICOM heads of government affirmed that for the Caribbean, keeping global temperature below 1.5 degrees is not an option, it's a matter of survival. Urgently call upon the international community to uphold its responsibility to protect the most vulnerable and maintain a central focus on the special case and particular circumstances of small island developing states, again making a case for special situation, and to affirm that securing a safe climate future for the Caribbean will remain under close consideration of CARICOM heads of government, with a view inter alia to elaborating further on a regional roadmap from ambition to action, with a focus on articulating regional needs and priorities, forging new partnerships across the whole of society, and strengthening CARICOM political engagement in multilateral processes to advance regional priorities. I think as a media, you should pay close attention to that, because it speaks to what action our governments are committed to. Articulating regional needs and priorities, a lot of these are articulated in our already published NDCs. Let's see what new partnerships that they're going to forge across the whole of society. A lot of climate justice issues will prop up under that, and strengthening the political engagement in the multilateral processes to advance regional priorities. I think we can't fail them on that. They're doing that. But how much of that translates to action on the ground at home, which is going to be a major preoccupation for us as we move forward. Next slide, I think we might have, yeah. And the last one, basically, which again speaks to urgency, to note that, and this is a borrow from another region, Indonesian presidency of G20 has identified energy transition as a policy priority and expressed the hope that the focus on sustainable energy transition will be framed in light of the temperature goal of 1.5 degrees centigrade. It pops up again. And so lend support to strengthened 2030 emissions targets that could be brought forward to the COP27, underscoring that in so doing, the G20 together can keep 1.5 within reach. You know, the alarming thing about the latest analysis was that we are on track to hit 1.5 long before the end of the century. And this is the reason for increased ambition and action. And we are pleading basically globally that the action that is taken in the energy transition is taken in the light of the need for us to achieve that 1.5 target. Calls also for global recognition of SIDS, of the SIDS need for finance for loss and damage to cover the costs of impacts and risks to which we cannot adapt. Just an example of that, you know, we are already seeing places like Vanuatu where they have lost territory to sea level rise. So that's loss. So how do you compensate for that loss? For instance, I think in Vanuatu, they're thinking of purchasing land somewhere else. I think it's in Fiji or somewhere. Who is going to finance that? The fact that they lost land is not as a result of their activities, but for those who are responsible, do you have a moral responsibility to compensate for what we are now suffering? That's the question. They urge all leaders to confront the reality that climate change poses an existential threat to SIDS. We know that. I tell our donors that, you don't have to tell us about doing vulnerability assessments and whatnot. We're living with the impacts of climate change. We have experienced it. And that, what better definition of the risk and our vulnerability than having to go through those painful experiences that we perpetually experience in the Caribbean. And that its impacts represent a code red for humanity and thus require immediate global action to reduce greenhouse emissions and provide accessible and affordable finance in line with the science to keep 1.5 degrees within reach. And finally, there is no more time for equivocation and no more time for delay. We, the CARICOM heads of government, demand action now. And I should say, demand action now at the global level. And I think I made this point earlier, Wesley. We also need at the national and regional level in the Caribbean to demand action now. Time for action. You will see that this Ambergris declaration, the mood and tone is very much in keeping with the yesterday's publication of the latest IPCC report, which calls for action, urgent action, and tells us basically that the next decade is going to be critical. It's our last chance to make sure that we can achieve that 1.5 limit. And if we don't act well, we'll have to live with the consequences. So I think I'll stop there. I hope I'm able to highlight the key issues, basically, that would frame Caribbean response over the next decade, starting from now, and that as a media community, that you get on top of these issues and to do what you can to educate the public. That I don't think there is any other issue that has greater justification for public sort of participation, inclusion, inclusivity, all of the things that we talk about under the Sustainable Development Agenda, than climate change, because we are all in the final analysis impacted. We are all going to be impacted in some way or the other. It's in our global interests, it's in our regional interests, it's in our national interests to make sure that we are at the table. All parties that are at the table, when, okay, I know you're taking measures to help us to deal with the challenges that we face, but how, when you put these new modalities in place, does it impact me apart from protecting me from climate? Does it have other bad influences or impacts on my well-being? So we need to chart this course together. And the biggest challenge really is getting our decision makers to come to terms that it's not politics as usual. We have to build partnerships. We have to reach across divisive corridors of politics and race and this sort of thing, and as a people basically chart our course forward. If not, the future doesn't look too bright, or we might find that those who survive really draws the line firmly between the haves and haves not in our society. So, as I say, as we move forward, it's so important that we adopt the principles of community, of gender, of disadvantaged communities, of poverty. All of these come together, and basically a holistic approach is the only way that this transition that we have to take as a matter of urgency will mean anything in terms of Caribbean well-being and Caribbean survival in the face of the climate challenge.
Neville, I have been, thanks so much for that. I have been tasked with attempting to moderate the conversation in the chat, to pull out the questions, the burning questions, because I mean, we're here to serve the journalists and the journalists have questions. So I've been tasked with pulling up some of those questions from the chat. And when I do, and in between, I'll try to squeeze in some of the questions that I may have, for you as well.
I was hoping you'd say, Steve, that you'll try to answer some of them too.
No, I have not been so tasked. I have been tasked.
Don't be so modest.
As someone who has been, quietly following in your footsteps, you know what I mean? Many footsteps behind, of course, to be able to at least translate some of the questions. No, but Neville, I want to thank you, as I said, for that, more than comprehensive look at the policy framework. If you have some questions, let me just pull one of the first ones from Mr. Chinapu. What are your thoughts on how the policies have in fact been changing decisions on climate and the decision criteria and action? Sorry, let me read that again. What are your thoughts on how the policies have in fact been changing decision criteria and action? And that's from Mr. Chinapu, from Chris.
Well, it's time for action.
Okay. I think
what I mean by that is, look, if you go through the Caribbean, all of our countries now have national climate change adaptation plans. They have, Vision 20-something, green growth, etc. There are a lot of policy documents, but I'm concerned that we haven't seen much change in terms of translation of that policy into decision-making and action. Again, I look at my country, Guyana, and we, of course, are going to be a big oil producer. But they're talking about a low carbon development strategy. And at the same time, when they're talking about shoreline development to support the offshore oil industry, you read articles about acres of mangroves being removed to put in infrastructure. I haven't seen all these new buildings going up, etc. I haven't seen anything about the vulnerability of the coastline in Guyana, particularly to sea level rise. The very first study that was done under the master's program by a Guyanese, Kofi Dalrymple, was about the vulnerability of Guyana's coast to sea level rise. Nobody is taking that on the into consideration. Wesley was talking earlier about building codes and whatnot. We have building codes. Remember, I showed you that project that we did at the Martian building in St. Lucia, where it was upgraded to withstand a Category 4 hurricane. Codes are there, but they are not enforced. Policy is wrong, but is a big gap in the Caribbean, I must say, between policy and decision making and implementation. I think now at the policy level, at the decision making level, there's a greater awareness of the need for action, and we're starting to see a bit of daylight in terms of some of the decisions that are being made. But I think there's still a gap. There's a lot to be done. And we hope that in this new era, our decision makers would take on board the excellent policy frameworks that are there and put them into practice. But there is a gap. There is a hiatus between the two at this point in time.
Agreed, Neville. I have another interesting question here, which would be particularly relevant for those of us who come from cricket-loving or cricket-playing countries, and it's from Mr. Henderson. And I'll attempt to read this one properly. The doctor mentioned frontline. Well, facing a frontline bowler crouched on the back foot is precariously painful and fun only for the umpires. And that's where SIDS are. So awareness is key. And I wish for some Laras now. I mean, this is a cricket analogy so that if we are in the front, if we are facing frontline bowlers, we need to be more prepared than being just on the back foot. And that being on the back foot is precariously painful and is only fun for the umpires as those watching on from the sidelines. So Neville, as a cricket fanatic yourself, what would you think? What do you say to that analogy?
Come, Steve, you underrate me, man. Not only a cricket fanatic, but an opening bowler.
You played for Queen's College. You're playing for Queen's College. I forgot.
No, opening bowler that had prodigious swing. So any batsman on the back foot would have been in big trouble during my day.
I'm very sorry. I'm very sorry.
But the question speaks to a very important principle. That is proactive action, being on the front foot.
Yep.
And basically starting now to build resilience so that we're in a position whenever we are hit with the impacts to withstand the worst consequences of those impacts. And a lot of our institutions have moved significantly. I'd like to use the example of SEDEMA. If you remember, previously SEDEMA was SEDERA, yep. Caribbean Disaster Emergency Response Agency. Yeah. And now they've changed. And in that change is the buying into the fact that apart from responding to disasters, they take proactive action, basically to strengthen resilience so that whatever occurs in terms of extreme events and whatnot, that unit is better prepared to withstand the worst consequences. Yeah, so you're absolutely right. We are still on the back foot in the Caribbean, and we need to see a lot more proactive action being taken across the region with our coastal infrastructure, with our agriculture, with our water, with our health. And I think the regional institutions are in that mode, and they're generating the type of information that basically would inform that proactive action. There's still a great need to communicate that information to the people who have to use it and to implement it.
Yeah, but Neville, I want to thank you for that response and to bring up something else. And by the way, this whole shift from DRM to DRR is, is something that was proposed in Sendai, and it's supposed to be how we are focusing now. We are supposed to be more focused on disaster risk reduction. So the question here from Chris, what are some of the key strategies that the media should employ to engage audiences in these policy issues? Does the media have a role in convening, sharing, helping to plan, coordinate, monitoring, and evaluating progress against the policy objectives? And I know I'm sure Wesley would want to chime in on this one as well, but Neville, what are your thoughts on that in terms of the strategies that the media should employ to engage audiences in these policy issues? Does the media have a role in convening, sharing, helping to plan, coordinate, monitoring, and evaluating progress against the policy objectives?
I think that's the answer. To organize more public discussion around some of these key issues. About a week ago, there was an excellent public discussion out of BVI with overseas territories media, where they had a magnificent discussion with the public on some of the issues germane to the whole climate risk that they face. So I for one would like to see media moderated public discussions on key issues that our decision makers or even our political activists, yes, are a bit too sensitive to bring to the public fore. They sweep these things under the carpet when really they should be in the public domain. And I think that's the best way for you to move forward.
Well, Neville, if I can just quote Wesley from the chat, media practice has the impact of mediating the public discourse, but should not consider itself to play an explicit role in the way other sections of civil society have specific roles to play. So that Wesley is more or less coming down on his much advertised, much publicized stance on the actual role for the media, for active media.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's really facilitating a discussion, providing the public with a platform to have a public discussion. We always depend on the EPA or some other government institution to generate a public discussion on issues. No, let's have another avenue where these issues that are critical get public hearing. And I think just by doing that, you would have addressed a major deficiency right now in the way we're dealing with some of the sensitive issues related to our regional response to climate change. Providing a platform.
Sorry, yeah, thank you. There's another very interesting question. I'm interested to know what role has China played in investing and in financing projects related to climate change. Any project that stands out, is China considered an important player? Thank you. This is from Laura.
No. They are an important player in terms of what we want them to do, stop building coal plants. But if you know, a lot of their investment in countries, apart from the infrastructure, is in the extractive industries.
Yep.
Which basically would have their own anti-climate change action overtures. So we don't really look at them as people who are too preoccupied with our concerns.
Yeah, And there have been documented instances of Chinese land purchase in other continents, particularly Africa, where they are seen as potential breadbaskets in the event of, further catastrophic climate-induced.
Oh yes, China's been buying up. I think Madagascar is one of the poor countries where they bought up a hell of a lot of real estate. And the whole idea is that those are going to be the farms that feed the Chinese in future.
Yep. Yeah. So Laura, I hope that answers.
Well, over the years, imperialist conquest has expressed itself in different ways.
Yeah.
So when we talk about big countries taking over and being guilty of malpractice, we'll have to point fingers in all kinds of different directions. It's only because of the current context of the geopolitics, there is this focus on China. But if you look at coal, for example, and Neville will know this, so would you, Steve, China is not the main or the only culprit when it comes to the use of fuels that add to the global carbon footprint. So I think that when we break the question down in that kind of way, particularly coming from our countries, which are small and developing countries that are being pushed and shoved and bludgeoned by the geopolitics, we need to be careful about how we approach it. I think that the problem is imperialism. It's not China. The problem is imperialism. It has been imperialism for a very long time, for all our history.
Agreed.
The question of imperialism.
Agreed, Wesley. And before I take the question from Tashwa, there's a question statement. Are you seeing any improvements in the way governments, especially the leaders in particular, take on board the advice given by the scientists and the implementation of policies? I refer in particular to the climate reports prepared by the Climate Studies Group, MONA, CIMH, etc. And this comes from Zadie. Neville, before I take the question from Tashwa, have you seen any improvement in the take-up of the information coming out of Michael Taylor's group and and some of the other agencies? And I suppose we could include 5Cs in that as well.
Well, that's very difficult to answer. You still have to force governments to that's a difficult question to answer. What we're getting done in the region, I don't think is any as a result of governments falling over each other to respond to the science that our people have been generating.
Okay.
We're still in a business as usual scenario. Years ago, just to give you an example, we had an offer from the Italian government of $60 million to implement a renewable energy project around the Caribbean. The only condition that they asked is that a small, well, call it an MOU, was countersigned by government saying that this project was desirable. We might use the excuse that at the time, the urgency for action in the energy sector wasn't as obvious. We lost that because we couldn't get governments basically to put a simple signature on a note. At the same time, the Pacific, they've just completed that implementation of transforming a lot of their energy systems to renewable, at least starting the process.
I'm sure
we find that disconnect unless you get a regional politician with an appetite for it, it doesn't happen. One such, our best period with the political directorate was when Jimmy Fletcher was minister in the St. Lucian government, because the Prime Minister St. Lucia has the responsibility to, as the spokesperson for climate change at the heads of government cabinet, and he delegated that responsibility to Jimmy.
Oh.
And under Jimmy's watch, we were able to put in place this regional climate change coordinating committee, which consisted of all of our institutions, SEDEMA, CIMH, CARDI, etc., plus some of the donors. We were trying to bring some coherence to action. But unless you get that political champion, you can't say that generally the political directorate is taking note of what is being put forward to them. No.
Thank you, Neville. Tashwa, sorry to keep you waiting. Please.
By the way, Steve, and that defines a strategy for us.
Mm-hmm.
That we need to look for those champions. Yes.
You have to find a champion. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Definitely. Agreed. Tashwa, please unmute.
Yes. Hi, everyone. Let me just turn on my video and stop being vain. Hi.
Yeah.
So it's just an intervention, not a question, in that one of the hats I wear, I forgot to mention what my role is earlier, is that I am firstly the media and education officer within the Department of Environment here in my country in Antigua and Barbuda. And Antigua and Barbuda is actually currently chairing the Alliance of Small Island States, AOSIS. And I am one of the communications advisors for AOSIS for this chairmanship. And one of the things that the regional ambassadors across SIDS nations always inquire whenever it is that we make a communications intervention is that we need more stories coming out of the Caribbean region, especially. This past year, doing communications for the Alliance, we get great international coverage. We get coverage within the Pacific Islands and the Asian and Indian Ocean regions. But in terms of stories coming out of the Caribbean, it lacks significantly. And it's not for lack of interest, I think, in the region. It's just that, as someone mentioned earlier in the discourse, media houses, they have priority stories, and sometimes certain stories get pushed back. So what we hope, what the chair really wants coming out of the region is more stories about what's happening in terms of how climate change is affecting us in the region. You know, the consequences of climate change. You know, we know these climate events are happening every year. I was living in Trinidad before the pandemic, and there were like floods for like 3 months straight in certain regions in Trinidad. Jamaica faces droughts, bushfires, and floods too. Here in Antigua and Barbuda, we're perpetually in droughts. We had recently Irma's impact on Barbuda. It's like climate change is already happening to us, you know, but sorry, 1 second.
Yeah, but while we await Tashwa's reconnection.
Sorry about that. Yeah, my apologies. So yeah, so it's we just want more stories coming out of the region. I'm gonna do some pitching now. We have the AOSIS media newsletter. You guys could send your email addresses or drop your email addresses in the chat, and I'll add you guys to our newsletter. We recently had a press release for the IPCC that was released yesterday. I'd love to share that with you guys. I know we already have some regional media on our sign up for the newsletter, but I just feel as though, well, I know for a fact we just don't get enough out there. And we are big hitters in the international climate change negotiating realm. We were one of the biggest voices at Conference of the Party last year, and we have representation from across the region in the major Caribbean islands. We have Kishan Kumar Singh and his team from Trinidad. We have Uname Gordon and her team from Guyana, from Jamaica, my apologies. And we have Decima Williams and her team from Grenada, and Dr. Hugh Seeley rest his soul.
Yeah.
That we lost him week before, but you know, we have his team in Barbados. And these are really huge voices in the negotiator realm for climate change. And we just want to make sure that the rest of the region are behind these big voices in getting our issues out there. You know, it's one thing that The Guardian and BBC and Washington Post post about our stories and our issues, but our regional audiences aren't really captivated by those stories. These are stories that we're getting out there to the international community to get their attention. We want these stories in the region for persons to know that this flooding that your community experienced is not just a climate event. There's a reason for this. There are countries responsible for this, you know, and that's what we want from regional media. Forgive my long-winded.
No. Seriously, before I take the question from Alicia, the comment from Alicia, that either Wesley or Kiran want to respond, either to acknowledge the accuracy or the veracity, or to
again, I stick to my point. The media are there for stories. Journalists are there for storytelling. If there are climate events that have a negative impact on a country, they're always covered. They're always covered. Many times, state negligence is in part responsible for the extent of damage. And so state negligence, which may not necessarily be very welcome on the part of governments, are not always registered as stories that speak to the realities of climate change. That's why I was saying in the storyboard, not everybody is going to like you, including the advocates, because the advocates would prefer a particular perspective on it. But if you're looking at it journalistically, you're looking at all of the different factors that contribute to the fact that the climate crisis is impacting on us in a very serious way, in an inequitable manner. And that inequity is sometimes on account of governance issues. Yeah. So the people who are involved in officialdom are not always going to like what you have to report. And so they would need to start accepting that. I don't think that the climate crisis is in any way underreported in the region. It's very much reported, but the treatment perhaps needs to enhance it. That's why we have these kinds of sessions. But I think that apart from the treatment issues, the climate crisis is covered every day in our regional media.
Okay, thank you, Wesley. Alicia?
Hi, morning. I'm not sure how my camera would look in this dark area, but I actually just wanted to, I guess, elaborate on something that Kash was said. I've never met her, although we're both in Antigua and Barbuda. I've never met her before. But she did say something that kind of, piqued my interest when she said there's not a lot of reporting in the local and regional media on environment news, and that's because other things take precedence. I think one of the issues is that when environmentalists, let's say they come on the radio, you do an interview with them, they have a tendency to be very technical with what they say. They talk about policy decisions, and they never make this connection as to how the population should care, how it really affects the population. They would go, for example, and said, okay, we went to the UN and we signed this great thing on fossil fuel, but okay. And that's what the people are thinking. And now us in the newsroom, we're very small, we're very limited. In my newsroom in particular, there is no specialization. So no one has a special beat. So when something comes up in environment, for example, I can't pinpoint one person and said, something's up, check this out. So they don't have the time to go and dive into that. And so what we find ourselves doing is just reporting what was said on the radio based on the technical point of view of whoever it is that's speaking. Most times it's the Diane Blacklane, Ambassador Diane Blacklane, who's in charge of the Department of Environment. I'll give you an example. In 2020 of October, I did a documentary on Yida, which is the first special economic zone that is being laid down. I don't even know if I should use futuristically, but was to be laid down at or within NEMA, which is a special management zone that is to be untouched, and there are certain restrictions. And it took me 6 months to go through that with the assistance of Connectus, which is an arm of the International Center for Journalists, 6 months. And she might be right in that when she says there is not enough reporting on it, because I was very surprised that something which would have been in the news, circulating in our papers, on radio for several years. When I did the documentary, I saw comments under it like, oh, where is this happening? When was this announced? Like, I was flabbergasted, because this is something that was in your face. But again, I think the problem is that we do not want to have the time, the understanding in some cases, to put it forward to the people who are listening to us as to how it affects them. I think the documentary I did was well received, because I did take the time, for example, to speak to fishermen and ask them, well, how does that affect you? Or to a farmer, how did that affect you? But the thing is, we don't have the time, we don't have the resources, and sometimes the Department of Environment, which is an arm of the government, is very difficult to get information from them, because there is a law in particular, dependent on who you're talking about, they need permission to speak to the media, as in governmental permission to speak to the media. So if something is happening, most times I can't go directly to a source. I have to go to the bigger heads who has to tell me, okay, go over there. That person may say, okay, I can tell you this, but it won't be on the record. So then there's also this level of secrecy when there shouldn't be. And it is, sorry. And we have the issue as well, where we're supposed to have this Freedom of Information Act, and we're supposed to have an information commissioner that I have not been able to tap into, and my colleagues as well. You would access them and they say to you, okay, last time, for example, I think that was last August, I was trying to find some information. I called the commissioner who was away and she was sick on medical leave, and she said she wouldn't be back till September. I said, is there somebody else that I could speak to? And she said, no, well, I'm the only person. So I asked a government official, and they led me to someone in the customs, and customs led me to somewhere else, and there's somebody else, that until I got absolutely nothing. So it's a lot of things to consider when you say there are not enough environmental stories, or environmental stories are not being shared enough. That's just all I wanted to say.
Thank you very much, Alicia. I want to turn to the two trainers present and to get some initial feedback before I go to Zadie. I mean, do you see any contextual framework for that, Wesley or Kiran, for the second statement from Alicia? I would account for.
No, Alicia made some very good points, and again, that's why I made the point in the chat that this is not just an environmental story. It's a story of governance, and part of the governance story has to do with access to information and the fact that our countries in the Caribbean are sworn to a code of official secrecy, that the culture of silence is more overwhelming than the official culture of openness and making things known. I think that we need to attend to that as a priority. Otherwise, these stories are not going to be told. You know, whatever, I mean, the environmental activists, yes, I agree. They have an important story to tell, but the whole story needs to be told. And it can't tell the whole story if the quality of governance remains at the current level.
Wesley, I am inspired by the two contributors from Antigua. In this sense, I think one of the things, one story that you should be telling throughout the region are examples of best practice. And the Antigua case is one in terms of how they have organized nationally to address climate change. Under very skillful direction of Ambassador Diane Black. They, for instance, remember I spoke about being accredited to the Green Climate Fund. The center and the CDB are accredited regional entities. Another tier is national implementing entities with the Green Climate Fund. Antigua and Barbuda was the first in the world that was accredited. They even had another first after that. They're the first national accredited entity that has access funds. They've got a 10 million fund from the GCF for a project which they're now implementing in Antigua and Barbuda, I think St. Vincent and the Grenadines and Grenada.
And Grenada as
I
well.
know it's a tree. It is in Grenada, is it?
Yeah.
Now, this is remarkable. And I think these are the stories that we need to get out in the public. Not only, hopefully it would inspire some of our other countries to, I know they have the aspirations, but show them that, look, this is not out of your reach. It could be done. The last thing, I think the media should have a really big presence at COP. The next COP is in
Cairo.
And the reason is that there's so much going on there. You have the, now you have my old friend Kiran, you have Uname from Jamaica, you have the negotiators from the region, interviews, now that we're head of AOSIS, daily interviews with them, bringing the region. You should have a public broadcast to the region about how these issues are being discussed and what is happening. I think that's a great opportunity. And the CDB has not been too averse to the idea of supporting that type of effort. So I'm putting it in your diary for future notice. But I think it's important, Mick, that you basically take a lead in this and make sure that there's a substantive media presence at the next COP. And not only that, that there is a facility to broadcast to the region, give them a day-by-day, blow-by-blow account of how the discussion is evolving.
Thanks for that, Dr. Trotz. I just wanted to say that Wesley made a point about the freedom of information. And the other thing is that we still need, while we do cover issues of climate justice, I think there are other layers that we are uncovering and that we are discussing here. And none of these can be possible, I think, when we work as lone journalists covering 5 beats in a newsroom, which is why, this effort is important and we have to continue doing not just these kinds of training experiences, but also with the stories and you all sending in story ideas. So one is that we need to keep the fight up collectively for freedom of information, access to information and data. We can't go it alone. I mean, it's evident we can't. We need to do it collectively. Secondly, MIC has pledged to make this a priority area so that we can try to pull the journalists in the region together. So from, and based on what Dr. Trotz is saying, have a media presence. Yes, I'm hoping that is something we could do, not just at COP, but at many other forums for our journalists in the region who can work collaboratively and do it together, because the teamwork is going to help us to bring the issues to the front burner and have more people pay attention to it. The fact that the stories will go on CIJN is also testimony that we are ensuring the stories will travel far and wide, because CIJN has had the experience of when we put a story there, the story that if you did in your country alone of 100,000 or 1.3 million people, it may stay there and circulate. But the experience of CIJN is that it exceeds that and gets 2 or 3 times or 4 times as many eyeballs. And that is because the entire region picks it up, and they could republish it for free and it travels to the US. I mean, that has been the CIJN experience. We were talking on shows in the US and we had US and Latin American colleagues, carry the stories of their media entities. That's why we're in Spanish and English, because we realize that the media viability issues does place limitations on the smaller media houses in the region. And when we have the opportunity to do this kind of work, we will continue to do it and to persevere so that the issues can be brought forward. So I just wanted to make sure you all understand our vision. After this set of stories, is it going to die? No. Our intention is to keep looking for the funding to be able to keep helping the journalists tell the stories until such a point where it becomes higher on the agenda in our local communities, where there will be greater fervor for it. But we're at the point right now when the truth of the matter is that we don't have, as individual media entities, the financial ability to do as much as we want to do. And you all who are freelance journalists here would know that better than anybody else. So this is our collective approach to do it together and to keep it going, because we've seen that happen with other stories that we've been able to do. So I think it is about wrap up time. I saw Zadie with her hand up for a while. Zadie, I'm going to let you take the last question and then we will wrap up.
Thanks, Kiran. This is not a question so much as a comment. Right, so of course Wesley, you just dealt with some of the financial issues. Wesley pointed to the fact that we are not short of coverage. We're not. One of the things is that we don't follow up, that's one. And secondly, we don't have the resources to do some of the kind of work that we want to do. But I am currently working with CBU to do some of what you're talking about, to produce material, but unfortunately this is only DRR, but DRR of course includes some climate information. And they are doing this so that they can put material free of cost on their platform for download for poorer. I like to say poor. It's not, yeah, but for the less fortunate among us, that is. So we have to come up with more of these kinds of efforts to fund the reports. And I can tell you, girls don't feel, or whomever, everybody, don't feel worried that your government, even though you're in the government information service, is not sharing information. It is common everywhere. I worked as government spokesperson, I worked as government information officer, and I had to be fighting them for the information that I can publish without their permission, So it's a fight that we have to continue. Thanks much.
Thanks for that, Zadie. Okay, friends, Dr. Trotz, as usual, I just learned so much after every one of your sessions. I want to thank you sincerely for taking the time to be with us again and to remind you that we are not letting you off the hook. Please be prepared to be engaging with us a lot more. And Steve, thank you very much for moderating the session, and to Wesley for this morning, and to all of you here who have added to enrich the discussion so much and to really show, that we can get this done if we work on it collaboratively. So we have our closing sessions on Thursday, some fantastic panels are planned, and I want all of you to be there. To your colleagues who are not here, please spread the word, send them the link, let them register. But there's going to be 2 great panels. We're going to hear more from the young people, and we're also going to hear from colleagues overseas who have been working on this area of climate justice and what their challenges and best practices are, so that we can have a joint discussion to see how we could possibly work on extending the stories. So on behalf of the Media Institute of the Caribbean and Open Society Foundations, I would like to thank you for being here for this, our 3rd installment of the Climate Justice webinar series, Journalistic Perspectives. I wish you all a wonderful day. Thank you.